Hey everyone, it's Peter Kerr from Daydream Nation, and I've got David Botas back to the channel. How are you, David?
Pretty good, pretty good. Trying to stay warm over here.
Well, I tell you what, over here it's 40 degrees Celsius. It is an absolute heat wave. So, anyway, that's what you get around this time of the year. Today, we are going to talk about Van Halen 3. So, this album came out with the lead singer of Gary Cherone. It went to number 8 in the Australian chart, number 4 in the US charts, and number 43 in UK. Only got certified gold. A little bit of a divisive album, David. It was
A
one of
little.
those, well, there's not a lot of love for it. It's a good opportunity that we just have a little bit of a chat, go over the album, things that we like, things we don't like, present our synopsis of Van Halen 3. So I'll throw it across to you. What was your first impression when listening to Van Halen 3?
Um, for as a preface, I became a bit of a big Van Halen fan just within this past summer. So I had never got the Van Hagar era. I liked singles for the longest time, and I kind of appreciate all of that. When it came down to listening to three, look, it's been 25 years. I remember when this came out. I remember the commercial and them putting the news on it when it came out, getting ready for school in the morning. And it, what I, not knowing how Van Halen was back then, Gary Cherone was just basically a punchline. When someone would bring up Gary Cherone and Van Halen, it would immediately just punctuate a giggle or yeah, right, that's a great pick for a vocalist in Van Halen and whatnot. My thoughts on it now, looking at it objectively, as if I dug it up after 100 years and it was in some sort of time capsule, is that I think that Eddie. It's been said that Eddie sort of steered this album, but unlike the other album that I always hear that Eddie steered, Fair Warning, this one has the opposite reputation, where it's not that big of a seller, but Fair Warning is beloved by the fans. I love it. This one is not Van Halen. It doesn't sound. If you can, let me put it this way: I think that putting the Van Halen name on this album actually cost them sales, which is counterintuitive. They could have just started a new band. They weren't going to do that. And there are long songs, which usually I'm all for, but always suggest that there's not quality control. There wasn't really a producer to rein them in a bit. So the egos of Van Halen at this point, along with the substance abuse and whatnot that was going on with the two brothers, I don't think a lot of people wanted to join Van Halen at this point. It's what they call a poison chalice. It's radioactive to sort of want to join the band at this point, because you're going to be compared to Sammy and David Lee Roth all the time. And I think that one of the biggest issues with the album is the fact that, and I've listened to Gary Cherone speak about this, they didn't have time to gel into a band. Had they toured and then recorded an album, this album would have sounded different. And I think it would have been for the better. Their second album apparently was about to be recorded, working on, and it got shelved. And then, that's when Cherone just left. Maybe that album would have been more cohesive, and it would have sounded like an actual band that has putting in the work. Gary Cherone just seems like he's in the band. He's a good vocalist, and I do like him in Extreme. And Barencourt, the guitarist for Extreme, sounds really good with Gary's vocals. But on this album, you just can't remove yourself from the dichotomy of how this is a Frankenstein band. Do you know what I'm saying? It's just parts that don't seem like there's no cohesion, and I really have a hard time just with how much air he's consistently putting out. This is like a judgment that gets put on Grime Bonnet in that Rainbow album, like Down to Earth or any of this stuff. There's a lot of air coming out of him. Seems like he's like yelling all the time. And Gary Cherone to me sounds like a mix between Sammy Hagar and Chris Cornell of Soundgarden. I can't get Chris Cornell of Soundgarden out of my head when I'm listening to this album. But the thing about Cornell is that there's a lot of light that he delivers with singing soft at times, and Gary will be singing a song where it seems like the music would suggest or the lyric would suggest that he's not belting out that much and being aggressive, and he's screaming in the verse like Cornell does in the chorus, but he like has that whole soft loud thing that grunge was known for at that time. So it's tough to listen to. You can't understand what he's saying sometimes. And I went back and listened to the Extreme album that had come out before Extreme had broke up in '95, and his vocals are fine on it. I can hear him clearly. So maybe there's a production error. It almost sounds like when you're putting the car stereo up too high and there's all that compression, and you just and it starts to sort of like ruin your speakers sound. That's what it sounds like when he's singing sometimes. And I have a real hard time. As I was telling you, Peter, I found an AI version of this album that had the vocals removed completely, and that at least helps so I can see is it him or is it the band that's not creating music that is endearing at all. It seemed like a real low point for Van Halen at this point.
I remember in the day when this came out, and it got a lot of real estate in the local record store, which was HMV. Big placards. They had the big stall, all the CDs. I used to go to HMV every couple of days. It wasn't ticking over. And a month later, the album was in the bargain bins with the cutouts. And I was thinking, ooh, for Van Halen. I mean, I was always kind of semi-excited when a new Van Halen album would come out. I'm unabashedly a David Lee Roth fan, but I still would listen to the Sammy albums with interest. But, when hearing that it was Gary Cherone leading the band, I thought, okay, this is interesting, and it might take it in a different direction. But it just didn't sell. Now, they toured Australia for the very first time, but in America and the UK and the rest of the world, you've got to imagine this is in 1998. Grunge had a wave, and everything was very much alternative rock. The question mark was, how would Van Halen fit in with the rest of the music or hard rock or rock music that was going down in that stage? There weren't really many survivors in the 90s. You had Pantera, you had Metallica that were kind of reinventing themselves a little bit, but how would a traditional band like Van Halen survive? Now, you've got to admit, there's a school of thought that Van Halen invented hair metal. They certainly influenced the Sunset Strip. So how would a band that goes back to that era would survive in 1998? So first listen to the album, I was thinking that it's very long. And for a Van Halen album, they're very economical. They usually clock in between 35 to 40 minutes, 45. I mean, different, the last album, that was around about 60, 65 minutes, but that was different. Lee Roth was back into the band and they were actually redoing demos. So it was like a presentation. But taking it back to Van Halen III, very, very long album. And I've always got an issue in the CD age that just because there's 78 minutes of space doesn't mean you need to put 78 minutes worth of material. Van Halen songs are punchy and there's hooks. And I'm listening to this album, David, and I'm listening. Where are the hooks? There's moments, there's flashes all the way through where there's moments of brilliance that you can sit back and, well, that's nice. You admire Eddie Van Halen's guitar playing, or there's a nice little melody line, but it just doesn't hang together. To me, it just seems like a lot of the songs take way too long to get where they're supposed to go to the chorus. Like the average song duration is between 5 to 6 minutes, or maybe around the 5-minute mark. That is way too long for Van Halen. Van Halen is punchy. Now, you were talking about the experimental element. Fair Warning is a masterpiece. It was experimental. It wasn't a commercial, but it had hooks. This album is experimental, but there's no hooks. Somebody said that this shouldn't have been a Van Halen album. This should have been an Eddie Van Halen solo album, because there's a lot of guitar interludes. I mean, he even does a little song at the end, which we'll talk about. Yeah, I just think that it wasn't built for those times. It's way too much experimentation, and which is not a bad thing. But if you want to get that, I mean, Van Halen to me are punchy. That's the whole, DNA of Van Halen. Punchy guitar pyrotechnics. To me, it's way too muted. And with Gary Cherone's vocals, I don't get a sense of personality. Personality is very big in Van Halen. Like, I listen to a David Lee Roth album and I know what I'm going to get. I listen to a Sammy Hagar, even though I'm not, huge Sammy Hagar fan, I get a sense of personality. I don't get personality on this album through the singing, because it sounds very generic and it sounds like a lot of albums that were going in on that day. And I do like extreme. I saw Gary Cherone this year tour Australia. Mighty fine band. He's a good lead vocalist. But for this album, I don't get a sense of his personality. It sounds very Sammy Hagar. It sounds like he's morphing into, it sounds like he's got his foot in both camps. Should I sound like extreme? Because he is bringing a lot of that musical sensibility, the extreme bit. But on the other hand, I want to, bring a little bit of Sammy Hagar into it. So my question is, where are the hooks? There's just there's too many songs on this album where it seems like they're figuring it out. So
yeah, the learning curve, in tandem with recording in the studio.
Yeah, I wouldn't say a learning curve for Eddie Van Halen, but I don't know. I know what you mean.
Yeah, as far as learning how to work together as a band and the cohesion and everything.
Yeah, let's cover Without You. So we'll just cover a couple of songs. So this is a video that I actually saw for the first time last night. Interesting video. Goes for 5 minutes 32. It's very energetic. What do you think of this song?
It's okay. And that's what you're going to get from most of how I feel about this album. The album sinks by the weight of its own name. I was watching an interview on YouTube that they did for MTV. And at that point, Extreme were a band that had a few albums, but they were known majorly for that More Than Words, like ballad. And they sort of brought it up by not bringing it up, by saying, oh, it's that song we're not going to name. A lot of people thought that Gary Cherone being in Van Halen, it was, oh, it's the More Than Words guy in Van Halen. And I think that when I listened to the album, and Without You is being sort of like, I think that was the lead video. That's the video I remember. Everything's frozen. Yeah. It seems he's just doing that yelling thing the whole time. And I'm wondering if he was trying to overcompensate for the fact that people thought that he was a softie and they had seen the More Than Words video on MTV and elsewhere on repeat for years, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Ad nauseum. So I'm wondering if that's why he's so, he just yells out, and I can't understand half of what he's saying on the song.
Trying too hard, because when you overcompensate, I was going to use the word nervous, but maybe that's not the right word. But when people overcompensate, they overreach, and that may be in his vocal delivery on this song. But it takes such a long time to get through the bridge to get to the payoff in the song. And when it's over, you kind of don't remember it. And then you play it again, and then I don't remember it.
I agree, 100%.
Eddie's doing a lot of rhythm guitar on this album too. Did you notice that? A lot of just,
I notice when he starts soloing, that's when I'm happiest.
Yeah, but there's a lot of rhythm on this song. Look, there's some good moments, isolated moments. It's very extreme sounding, but I think it goes back to what I said earlier. It doesn't hang together as a song. So I don't think this song did well commercially, David, and that's why it sort of flopped. Because you've got to have a punchy lead single to give the album some momentum. And this flopped, and I think probably stalled the album.
Peter, can I ask just for some context, what Van Halen did directly before this, Balance, did you like that?
It was interesting. They were going in a different direction, but it's not one of my favorites. What about you?
I like it, and I can see that the maturity, they're trying to do this more mature sound on Balance, and I can see this being a continuation of that. But I think that this is a case study for how important Sammy Hagar was to the writing process of the band. In the same sense that when 5150 came out, for the people that didn't like Van Hagar, that was a case study for how, how instrumental and important David Lee Roth was for the band. So you're really feeling this. I listened to Balance last night, and I was like, I like this album a lot. There's hooks, there's catchy stuff. Like songwriting's fine. It's commercial, but I'm not mad at it. This goes to your point about how it just seems like Gary wasn't able to really write or contribute much in this band, and I guess the Van Halen brothers were just like, we're not letting anybody tell us what to do ever again, and that's to the detriment.
Yeah, well, it was produced by Eddie Van Halen and Mike Post, who was a buddy of Eddie Van Halen, did a lot of TV theme work. So, yeah, basically the balance of power was definitely with the Van Halen brothers, and it always has been. I mean, look, it's their name. But getting back to that album that you were just referencing, a lot of folk rate that as their favourite Sammy Hagar album with Van Halen. And actually, I did a show earlier this year about your top 3 Van Halen albums of all time. And a lot of folk picked that in their top 3 out of the Sammy Hagar one. So, yeah, there you go. A lot of people like that album. But not many people like this album. And One I Want, I have a real problem with this song. I think Gary Cherone's diction is mumbly. I've listened to this. It's really got a real funny tonality about it. And you listen to his diction, and it's like he's got marbles in his mouth. I find this really, really annoying. Another thing I've noticed, one thing I think I've read that Michael Anthony was being kind of pushed out of the band at this point. His presence is not all the way through on bass. Eddie played a fair amount of bass on the album. Yeah, I don't hear Michael Anthony's piccolo backup vocals. That's a big negative for me. I found that a little bit jarring, just hearing different backup vocals. Did you notice that?
I didn't. I was distracted.
Yeah.
By the mediocrity.
Yeah. Anyway, with One I Want, have you got anything to add on that one? Or?
Yeah, that one, I remember isolating that one as like sort of like what I like to say, the microcosm of the album, because like the lyric in this song is this sort of like, it's almost like a social commentary, rhetorical statements. There's a funny line where he says he just keeps listing down, and it reminds me of like the John Lennon song "God," which is just sort of like a list. And then Roger Waters would pick that up and do that, like in Brain Damage and Dogs and whatnot. And I love it when they do it. On this song, what's weird is like you're doing this rhetorical like social commentary lyric, but I just don't understand the setting where he's doing that yelly thing the whole time. Whereas
Mm,
like it seems like this song would have benefited from him having a little bit more. I don't know if tenderness is the correct word, but something that's just a little bit more emotive that doesn't that not emotive in an aggressive way. So it's
mm,
hard to sort of like pay attention to the lyric, but he's shouting it the whole time. You know,
yeah,
it reminds me of like if Johnny Rotten or Graham Bonnet sang "God" by John Lennon. It just doesn't fit. You know,
that's an
um,
interesting combination.
yeah, it's jarring.
Yeah. Talking about emotional, there is a decent song on this album that I want to talk about, and that's the Josephine Nah song, which was about their parents or their mum, Eddie and Gary's mum, and it's a little bit of a lament about how when they were much younger they were more vibrant. There is a bit of an emotional aspect, and I really appreciate that. And this is sort of like a palate cleanser. It's like with all the shouting and the hollering and the
Yeah,
foghorn vocal delivery, you've got this little nice little tune in the album that breaks things up. And there's some nice. This is where there are some really nice harmonies. I had a bit of a Queen Beatles feel to it. So I don't know what your thoughts on this album, but I put this as the best track on the album.
I did notice that that takes place on the second side of the album, and the second side does get a bit softer. You do on that song, and I believe the song was it the song before it? No, I think it's a song after it, "Year to the Day." Those songs, at least he Gary allows himself to sort of sing soft. He does start doing the putting all that air out of his throat like in the chorus, like I believe on that track. Was it "Year to the Day"? I don't remember which one at the time because the songs just are not that memorable on this album. Um, but I appreciate the fact that they must have said you got to do a little bit of a lightness here, you know. And it seems just really imbalanced, no pun intended, to have all those songs sort of like show up on the second side, and then the first side is like more of the him like yelling and it's just more aggressive.
Yeah, the track listing's not flash. You need to break it up. But look, I thought that had a little bit of that was kind of the emotional core of the album, and that works the best where it's sort of more stripped down. Um, Dirty Water Dog, interesting sort of guitar. He's got that watery flange wah type guitar sound, and he plays this a little bit during the course of the album. As I said, there's a lot of guitar interludes, so that's why I'm having in my head this is more of a soul kind of. Was this more of a solo album? Because he
Mm,
was threatening to do a solo album at some stage.
mm.
Cherone vocal riffs all over it. Kind of sounds perfunctory, but it's only. I mean, this album song goes on for 5 minutes 27, but you got to get to 3 minutes and 42 seconds, and you get this searing guitar lead break from Eddie Van Halen, which he does his firecrackers, and you go, oh, he's back. So this is what is the problem with this album. There's moments. There's some great moments in the album, but they're buried in the songs and they don't last long enough to hook you in. And it sort of goes into what you were saying about the Frankenstein approach, or it just doesn't hang together. But yeah, you got any thoughts about this particular song? I'm not sure if you wanted to talk about it. Dirty Water Dog.
No, I thought I pass on that one. Um, I give you another one though. So I thought that the From Afar was probably, which is a song that comes right before it. I thought that that song was one of the better songs on the album, just because I think that's you get to hear like a little bit of like a nice like soft guitar, and I just happen to I like the riffing in it. It seems like it's a bit more inspired than some of the what I hear as mediocrity on this album. I'm apprehensive to just want to like slam an album because I don't. It comes back to bite me. Like a year or two later, I'll listen to this and I'll love it. And I'll be like, oh man, what was I
Yeah,
thinking? It happens so
yeah,
often. But I kind of wish that more people would listen to this album. Ironically, because I think that there are things that people are going to pick out that they might actually thought worked well
mm,
in Van Halen at this time. You know, when you're talking about '98, like the only other band that is sort of sticks out like a sore thumb that was in the category of like who can continue to exist is Aerosmith, and they were having like a huge number one hit at the time, but it was written by other people. And Van Halen, I don't think had song doctors. So
no,
you make a
no,
good point where like you need performance enhancement to exist this long already, and it's just tough. I appreciate that this album seems like it's honest. It's an honest like we're just not trying to do pay attention to radio. We're just working together and making what we feel like organically like sounds good at this particular time.
yeah, yeah,
So I appreciate that about the album.
yeah,
Um,
sure.
do I do I want to take these? Do I think these songs are as good enough for as B sides from some of the great stuff from Van Hagar and David Lee Roth? No, I don't. These are
Mm,
still at the bottom. Like the best song on this album doesn't touch 90% probably of what came before it, in my
yeah,
opinion.
yeah. How many I say? This has copped a lot of flack because of Eddie on vocals. Somebody said that Eddie sounds like Roger Waters, and I tend to
Yes,
agree. It's got that weird.
yeah,
This song has a really weird um, closing time in a bar sound to it. You know, the pub's about to close
yeah.
in 5 minutes. Everyone's a little bit drunk, and you know that really world weary approach. I find it quite interesting, and you know, if this was going to be the last song on any Van Halen album before Eddie's passing, I don't think it's too bad a finish. I don't mind this song because it's kind of weird, but at the same time, I'm attracted to it. I can't explain it.
I think that's the if anyone's charmed by this album, what you just described about the last song is I believe is what they would be charmed. It's just so it's so like eccentric in the catalog. It doesn't fit. That song you hit it on the money with Roger Waters. I was listening to that earlier, and that's the note I took was that this sounds like something from side C of the Wall. It sounds like Nobody Home.
Yeah, yeah,
He's almost doing like a Leonard Cohen type of thing.
absolutely. A piano and voice, very stripped back. I don't mind it at all. Do you like it, or do you think it's a stinker?
It's just it doesn't really do anything for me. I think that I'd listen to it again just because I want to hear like Eddie sing.
Mm,
I think the big elephant in the room that I'm realizing is that Van Halen had uh, a very good vocalist in the band, and they would never ever do what Genesis did and let the other guy come in that sings and take over the band and just be a trio. And I'm talking about Michael Anthony. I had recently seen he performed like Ain't Talking About Love. And I'm not saying that he's better than Dave in his prime, but he sounds better than what I heard Sammy sound like it. And he probably has the bona fides to sing that song more than anybody else on the planet. If you're going to
mm,
give anybody else on the planet, he sounds better than Eddie. So that just wasn't going to happen. Imagine if that happened, if they just and then they were three themselves, and it was just a
yeah,
trio, it would
yeah,
have sounded good.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I think in summary, I think it's a flawed album. It it needs tighter editing because I just think each of the songs are just way too long. It needs to be tighter, to the point, more punchy, and um, yeah, I just think maybe I don't know. Without You may have not have been the best lead single off the album. Um, it just needed that killer hit single to just sort of it would have propelled them in the late '90s. But I don't know if Cherone was the right fit. I saw a live concert on YouTube in Sydney. He's fine. He's got his own thing. But I don't know. I just, yeah. What's your views?
Um, the fans protested. I mean, and I think "Fire in the Hole" was a better single than "Without You." I don't think that
Mm.
I don't think it touches, their aggressive singles and party time stuff that came before it. But Gary, if you're watching, I think you're a great vocalist. I think you're a talented artist.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
really do. I don't
absolutely.
want to. It would be easy for me to say this guy just. It would be easy for me to say whatever the guy that was on Uriah Heep Conquest. Sorry, guy, I really don't like your vocals. But that's not. It's like you have talented people that just don't. It sound like they fit.
Sometimes it just doesn't fit. There are some
Yeah,
things that just fit, and some don't. And I think for this band, you need a big personality because Eddie is a big guitar player. He's got a huge sound, and when you've got all that pyrotechnics and firecracker guitar licks, you need to counterpoint it with somebody that's not um, that has that personality. And I think what you were saying is Cherone is overcompensating. He's pushing his vocals into this loud type of. I mean, he's projecting himself as something loud, but it's not quite working.
you know what it reminds me of too is Black Sabbath. So when Black Sabbath first got Dio, and Dio would do that like
Yeah.
he's doing that. I liked when he did that, but I could see
Mm.
that you're trying to make yourself sound more evil, right? When another thing about Sabbath is when Eternal Idol got. I don't know if you're a Tony Martin era fan
Mm.
of Black Sabbath or you follow that, but from my understanding, I haven't listened to much of Tony Martin, but like I do appreciate it more now. And from my understanding is that when he had joined the band with Eternal Idol in like '87, the album was pretty much all set up, and the harmonies were all set from Ray Gillen, who had worked with and who was supposed to be the lead singer at that point. And had Gary Cherone stepped into the shoes of a Van Halen album where Sammy had written everything and there was all that like experience with the band, it would have came out different. If Tony Martin had come into Eternal Idol and at the last minute and just sort of like, hey, crash course in joining Black Sabbath, I think that album would have fared a lot worse. And I think that sort of had the it been in the stars that Gary was going to be able to just like not have to figure out his identity in the band for their debut together and sort of like go on tour and then have some more time where they're working together for the second album. I can almost guarantee that second album was going to that it was going to have an identity, and that's what I think that
Absolutely.
this album lacked.
Yeah. So instead of recording something and trying to figure it out, they would have got sea legs on the road,
Yeah.
more of that chemistry, and then the album would have had that chemistry. Because
Mm.
sometimes you can put a supergroup together and it's on paper, but it doesn't work. You like a
Yeah.
football team, you get all these great players, you put them in the team, do they gel instantly? No, they've got to know each other. They've got to work it out. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Always great to have you on the show, David. And I'm glad
Thank
I
you.
got you, twisted your arm to talk about Van Halen 3. Look, there are some moments on this album that are good, but for the overall, I think it's probably maybe for fans only. I wouldn't recommend this to somebody that hasn't heard Van Halen for the first time. I would probably give them Van Halen 1, Diver Down, or 1984. All right.
Mm.
So you can see, David, we're going to do more shows in 2024. We've hit 2,000 subscribers on Rock Daydream Nation, and we're just going to keep on building and just doing more shows like this. So tell us what you think of Van Halen 3. Put your comments down. Give us a like. Give us a subscribe. Click the bell. And we will see Dave. I'll see you, Dave, and me in 2024. Cheers. See you later.
Yes.